Right, good morning, everybody. Thanks so much for being here. My name is David Plylar with the Library of Congress, and I'm pleased to present a little bit about the Chrysler collection, the Fritz Kreisler collection at the Library of Congress. The title of the talk is New and Used Chryslers. I fear that I didn't realize at the time when we came up with this that the DC Auto Show was this weekend. So some of you may be either confused and or sorely disappointed in what I'm going to speak about. But one of the points of this is a declassified presentation, which is meant to be a bit more informal and just a chance to kind of give an introduction to some of the breadth of the types of collections that we have at the Library of Congress. We happen to have a wealth of violinist, performer, composer types of collections. And some of you, I imagine that some of you are very aware of what those are, but with Heifetz and Schering and others. But Chrysler is a particularly interesting one because he was also a composer and a controversial one in some ways. And he also had a number of transcriptions that he was well known for. And these transcriptions, this is kind of the composer-performer's way of kind of getting out there. You find a lot of these transcriptions in these collections of these major violinists. So the origins of this particular collection, Chrysler has been important to the library in many respects. One of the major things that he did first was, I'm not sure exactly of the chronology, but he gave the library the Brahms Violin Concerto manuscript and the Chausson poem. And so those were gifts of Fritz Kreisler to the Library of Congress, and we now, of course, those are some of our treasures that we have. We also have numerous instruments that I know many of you are excited about. I had been hoping to have on display today the baby Chrysler violin, but unfortunately it's being repaired right now, so we weren't able to pull it out. But we do have the Guarneri that Chrysler gave to the library in the early 50s, 1950s. And we actually just had that performed on January 12th with Europa Galante. Fabio Biondi played on it. And so we try to have it, a lot of violinists seem to prefer that of many of our instruments. And so it's always a great chance to hear them and get a chance to hear them live. So that's kind of an exciting thing. In fact, maybe one thing while I'm on the topic of the violin, I should just say a little bit about what Fritz Kreisler said about this particular violin, just because he's such an interesting character and had an interesting way of putting things. Let me pull it up. So he says, violins are frail, and there must be good fairies at their birth if they are to survive for 200 years. They are full of adventure. Here is my Guarnerius, and he's speaking about this one. It was brought from Spain by an English sailor who had stolen it in some raid of the Napoleonic Spanish War. The sailor sold it for a guinea, though it was worth many thousands. But to the sailor it was just a fiddle, like any other. He might have destroyed it in a waterfront bout. Already he had come through one war, and perhaps another. My Guarnerius took plenty of chances of destruction in those wandering years, but it escaped everything. He goes on to talk about its provenance and other things about it, but ultimately it comes to this. It is superb and pathetic with its clouded destiny. There is no end to the music in it, if it is well kept. To whom will it finally appeal? But I know less of its future than of its past. I know only for the present we are joined. He's no longer joined with it, of course, especially once he gave it to the library. But one interesting document that I pulled out and that you can take a look at is that document about giving the violin to the library, because he has a special clause in there that says, maybe every once in a while I could borrow it, just to, if I need to play it or whatever. So that's kind of a funny aside about the instrument. But that instrument did not come as part of this main collection. Much of the materials in the collection came from Chrysler himself as gifts in 1955, from the estate after his death in 1970-71, and then by a person named Louis Lochner, who was his main biographer. His I think he came out with his biography when Chrysler was still very much around in 1950, and he didn't die until 62. But Lochner gave these materials for that relate to his biography and other materials that were just there was too much information to include in the one book. So that can be interesting for people who are especially interested in Chrysler and just the development of a biography even. It's really interesting to look through those materials. So you should be aware that those are there as well. So some of the things, and I have to apologize, I don't know how loud I sound. My head's a bit stuffed up, so I'm not sure if it sounds boomy to me, but hopefully it's okay. I have a soft spot for original works by composers who are not thought of as composers or who are just simply overlooked for whatever reason, because oftentimes there are lots of gems there that I think really should get attention. Chrysler is no exception. I'm not counting this particular piece among them, but I think it's a kind of astounding work because it's just on this front page here. It's a dedication page to Joseph Helmsberger, who was one of his first, not his very first, but one of his first violin teachers at the Vienna Conservatory. And the date there is kind of the astonishing one. It's just 1883. And so this was a 7-year-old Chrysler. And so this is just to give you a sense of what he was doing at that time. Another interesting thing about him, he got his start early, as one can see. He studied theory with Bruckner, which is kind of a funny, it's just kind of it sounds apocryphal, but a lot of things sound apocryphal with Chrysler because he tended to exaggerate everything and told lots of stories. But one of the stories that came out of it was that with Bruckner, he asked him to start a fugue on the, just for the class, and Chrysler couldn't think of what to do except that Bruckner had he had about a bunch of fugues that he had passed out to the class before to take a look at that were Bruckner's own. And so Chrysler just started to do one of Bruckner's, but Bruckner didn't recognize it. So Bruckner was like, well, that's pretty good. Good job. And so he was able to kind of get away with things. And another example of how he was able to get away with things was that he was one of those lucky few musicians who didn't really have to worry about practicing so much after a certain point where, I think Rachmaninoff was the one who said, well, he gets his practice by performing so much because he was such a constant performer, but he didn't really take much stock in actually practicing. He later changed his tune, and when it came down to working with other people who didn't have that particular amount of luck, I guess you could say, so pedagogically he changed his tune. So some of the things that we get in these collections are just kind of curiosities, and this one I just thought was funny because it's what it says there, if you can't quite see it, and I have it out here too as well. It says, I don't remember whose poem this is and why I did not finish it. I believe it must have been 40 years ago that I wrote this. So it's just like a little sketch of something. There's you kind of often get these little notes from composers saying, if they're looking back on these, I can barely remember what I did 2 weeks ago, so it's understandable, 40 years. But what's interesting for the Chrysler materials is that there are more songs than I thought there would be. So that's something I think is underexplored and worth taking a listen to. And I couldn't find examples of some of these, with the exception of, I think I have it up here, with the exception of violin transcriptions of his own songs. So there's this. He wasn't a singer, so he tended to, do what he could to get his music out there. But when it comes to the songs, I picked out one of several. There's not a ton, but there's a good number. This is O Sanctissima. It says freely adapted to a melody by Corelli, and it freely adapted is very much the operating words there. But what's interesting on this dedication page, or the title page, you might see that it says, to my dear friend John McCormick. This is Irish tenor, who he had worked with, he performed with, and we have some of his materials as well in different locations in the library. And so they're very interesting to kind of, I don't know that people have really gone through and correlated all these things that are there, but it's interesting to see these works that were done with specific performers in mind. And it might be that they just fell out of favor when he was no longer performing with those particular people. Just as an example, I'll play a little bit of the violin version of this. We also have, of course, several of the more well-known works, the Liebesfreude and the Liebesleid. We don't have all the information about them or all the different versions of them, though. The ones that we have are orchestral versions with a number of different types of corrections and changes made to them. For instance, with the Liebesfreude right here, this is the version for violin and orchestra, and the date on it is December 1941. The piece dates from well before that. He'd been playing it for a long time. It's actually unclear exactly when he wrote it. My sense is that the violin and piano version was first, and that was what he did as a way to kind of get things through. And I'll have more to say about that in a minute, about what he did to kind of develop his own repertoire. But I have this out on the table here. You can take a look at it in a few minutes. I think that it's quite something to see the transformation in these kind of very famous melodies and things that you might know. The orchestral version is different from the piano version that might be more familiar to you. You may know the Rachmaninoff transcriptions. We have some of those Rachmaninoff materials related to this, as well as Chrysler's transcriptions of Rachmaninoff, and including one of those is out here, which is the G minor prelude. He also did a number of Rachmaninoff songs that we have here, including the Marguerite key, which is, I always get confused whether it's daisies or lilacs, but one of the two flowers that was kind of one of his famous works. So we'll take a look at that. And going on to more transcriptions. Before I do that, I'll just mention that there are a lot of other materials, which I don't have any recorded examples to give you, but a string quartet, about a 30-minute work. Most of his pieces tended to be very short for the reason, some say just for recording reasons, but also just to kind of attend to what people were used to or could attend to easily in concerts. We also have one of his Singspiel Sissy. We have all of the or most of the materials for that, I believe. When it comes to transcriptions, naturally they tended to be mostly for violin and piano. So we have out here the Cavatina from the Opus 130, the B-flat major quartet of Beethoven, which will actually be performed at the library in just a few weeks, February 16th, I think. And which the library also happens to have the Presto movement from that of Beethoven's manuscript on hand, and that should be on display as well. But Chrysler did a version of this, and I thought it might be interesting just to hear a little bit of the sound of the string quartet, but just keeping this in mind. So as you can notice, the choices that he starts to make as to what he gives himself to do are well thought out, and in general, in all of his transcriptions, that's the case. You'll find that there are also types of coloristic things that he might do, but he tends to really just rely on I think the power of his own sound and the particularly distinctive sound that he's known for to really kind of bring these things across in performance. One just kind of a side note on another transcription. Again, we have about 130 or so transcriptions of his in this collection in manuscript or in an annotated format. Sometimes he made decisions that made a bit more sense for violinists. So in this case, we have the the G flat major impromptu of Schubert, piano impromptu from Opus 90, number 3. And in this case, it's put into A flat. And this is kind of interesting, A, because it makes it easier for it. G flat is one of the most comfortable keys for a pianist. A flat's fine too, but it's a little bit different for a string player. But what's interesting, and I didn't have a chance to really look at this in detail, but we have a Heifetz transcription of the same work that's in G flat, and so it's something that I think is worth taking a closer look at. And Heifetz in that case does more, I think, octave work and things like that towards the end just to change it. But I have this out on display as well, and we'll take a look at that. One thing that when you talk about transcriptions and you talk about Heifetz, you have to talk about what we call the deception. And this is just a show of hands. Does anybody in here know about the big, what I'm talking about when I say the big Chrysler deception of mid-1930s? Okay, so that's, well, good, that'll make it seem like it's a cooler story when you haven't heard it. So Chrysler had, he had this, he just got into this habit early in his career, especially as he was just going around to produce these pieces and ascribe them to different composers. Usually they're composers that people don't know, like Pugnani or somebody like that, or even like Stamitz, or people who you might know now, and now that we have access to the internet and lots of greater access, everybody has greater access to libraries and things like that, it would be a little harder to pull this off now, but there was not really any grand scheme or anything like that. He just started to do this to say that he was doing transcriptions for violin and piano of works by these lesser-known people. And I have on display over here a set of works called Klassische Manuskripte. And those are, it was this set that was published, and it was ascribed to all these different people, including like Louis Couperin and people like that. We know them now, and had people known them a bit better then, they might have, started to turn their head like that a little bit when they were listening to it as to whether it was exactly that, like that composer or not. But there's a kind of a funny build-up to the revelation that these were not transcriptions at all, but they were Chrysler's original works. And it turns out that it has to do with the Liebesfreude and the Liebesleid. In fact, Chrysler Liebesleid about it. So, so what? I just want to give you a sense of what he told to his biographer Louis Lochner about when he had put forward the Liebesfreude and the Liebesleid as posthumous transcriptions of posthumous waltzes by Joseph Lanner. And then he did the Caprice Viennoise, another famous piece of his, as his own work. So he presented that one as being his, and the other two as being transcriptions. And so this is the critic saying, "A feeling slightly akin to bad taste was engendered by the somewhat daring juxtaposition of Chrysler's Caprice, to be sure a charming offering, and the dances of Lanner, these delightful genre creations filled with Schubertian melos and reflecting the good old Vienna days for which encores were enthusiastically demanded." Chrysler then pointed out that it was, in fact, he had written all of them. And he was depressed about it, and he decided then and there to confess to the authorship of those dances, and they were published under his name. But then nobody else caught on that might apply to other works that he had done. And so so from fairly early on, people knew that the Liebesfreude and the Liebesleid were his. But there's things like this, the manuscript here of it's a concerto by Antonio Vivaldi. And I just want you to hear a little bit of it. And what's always, it's always one of those things when you look back you think, oh, I would have caught that. So it's so you just get a sense of what it was. And what I always thought was that, wow, from right away it's really interesting. And for me, that wasn't the first thing that I always think of when I think of Vivaldi concerti. I mean, to be, that's my particular prejudice. But at the same time, when this was being performed, and this was an early type of thing, Vivaldi wasn't as well known as he is now in terms of these concerti being out there for people to consume. So it's unfair to think that people would have any real sense of reference, even learned critics of sorts. So this was just one example, but those ones and the classical manuscript ones are the ones that were the really contentious ones, because what happened was then around 1935 he had decided to have, I think it was Carl Fischer at the time, publish them under his own name. He'd already made this decision, but he was doing an interview for the New York Times, and the interviewer, whose name I'm just forgetting at the moment, the interviewer had actually had Harold Spivak at the Library of Congress, the chief of the music division here, do research into some of these, looking for the sources of these works that were just so that he could he was trying to be a credible journalist and make some comparisons between the originals and these transcriptions to see where the differences were. And Spivak came up empty-handed. So they're saying that these were not there, with the exception of, I think, one Corelli, 8 bars of Corelli or something like that. So the reporter asked, are these actually just your compositions? He just said, yeah. And it wasn't such a big deal. Everybody was like, oh, okay, oh, well, not a big deal. But most people took it in good humor, and his excuse was that he felt bad in his early programs having his name everywhere on the programs. So he wanted just to have just some representative people, and they were the kinds of composers that he figured nobody really knew anyway, and so it wasn't going to be. And maybe he had done more for them in terms of them being more than just a name in a paragraph in a history textbook by getting some interest in those composers. However, certain critics, especially Ernest Newman, who is best known, I think, for the giant Wagner biography, 4 volumes, took great offense to this and took him to task about basically academic dishonesty, that type of a thing. And Chrysler was stunned by this. And so we have some materials actually we have a good amount of materials, and I just pulled out a little bit of it, about his response to that, and that kind of going back and forth between Newman and Chrysler, because it was one of those things that I think Chrysler wasn't expecting, and then he wasn't expecting to have to justify, and he started to wonder, why does it matter if you liked the music before you knew who it was, But of course, Newman also was saying that it was distasteful to mislead the public and that sort of a thing. But Chrysler always maintained that he hadn't done so with an aim at anything nefarious. And again, these are hardly nefarious types of things that we're talking about. We're short little pieces. But it was kind of an interesting thing that blew up with this New York Times article in 1935. So one of the neat things, the reason I bring up that story is because it is a bit central to Chrysler as a transcriber and as a composer, because he often wrote things in the style of a particular composer. Usually he would acknowledge that. He'd say, in the style of Dittersdorf or somebody like that. But sometimes he would not acknowledge that. And our collection has a lot of materials that are related to not only those types of criticisms, but also other types of press exchanges and correspondence in general, which I'll get to in just a moment. One thing that people don't quite realize, I think, as much about Chrysler is that he was also a pretty fine pianist when it came down to it, at the beginning especially. Not because he practiced, but he just naturally had no problem doing stuff. The reason this matters to us now is that it led him to produce his own I hesitate to call them reductions. Rather, there have been adaptations of reductions or transcriptions of orchestral versions for violin and piano of major works. A couple of years ago, we had I didn't know about this until a couple of years ago, we had this really interesting talk with some Sibelius experts who had found this Chrysler's version for violin and piano of the Sibelius Violin Concerto. And so Chrysler had done the piano part for it, and I think he had made a few suggestions for the violin part, but mostly just looking at the piano part. So that was something that he did, and he did well. He tended to do it in a way that was a bit more complicated than what was in a typical reduction, which is something that I admire, but I also have mixed feelings about, because oftentimes the types of reductions, if you've ever worked as an accompanist, you know that it's often you get really terrible things that you have to read and try to sort out. So you appreciate it when somebody really tries to make it so that it can be like a work that you're performing with the violinist and not just the supporter. But we have these for a number of works, so it's interesting. I pulled out a couple of the Bach ones. So you can see part of what he did was, I think I have A minor, and he would take other editions like the Wilhelmia, and also by James Brown, who I don't think is that James Brown, but he'll take the published version, this is from 1902, I think, and just pencil in all the different things he would do differently. And so then he would create his own version from that. And that's actually, that's a technique that I think is used more often than you'd think, as a way to kind of get the bones of a piece down for a transcription and make it better, or make it suit your particular needs. And so Chrysler didn't want to have just a pro forma, reduction if he had to play with piano. But in any case, these are interesting to me. I think that they're interesting. We also have a manuscript version of the D minor violin concerto that was really became known as the Harpsichord Concerto. Bach also. And there are multiple other ones in the collection that you can explore and check out. One other thing that's interesting about these is that, or that are along these lines rather, is that he would also do accompaniments for solo violin works. This is actually a tradition that has, it's a long tradition going back to people like Mendelssohn and Schumann would do this for Bach solo violin works or solo cello works, just trying to make it into a performance piece in a recital context. The library also has, we have the Rachmaninoff's version of the Partita E major. And in this case, we have, I think I'll play a little bit of it, we have the Chrysler piano accompaniment to that solo violin work. You'll recognize it right away if you don't know it offhand. I'll let it go until there so you can start to hear that he starts to add voices. So this continues throughout, and this is also a tradition that was actually, it became something that was a thing that both Rachmaninoff and Godowsky did, Leopold Godowsky. We have a number of these manuscripts here actually at the library as well, where they would, in addition to kind of transcribing it for the piano, they would use the polyphonic capabilities of the piano and the multiple fingers of the pianist, usually 10, to kind of explore other contrapuntal possibilities of the works. So I just spoke about this one, but this is one of the ones that we have on, that you'll be able to look at over here. And then also in his hand. Another thing, we have a number of cadenzas of Chryslers, and those are always interesting, I think, for people to take a look at. Some of the ones, I don't think I put these out, I think I ran out of room, but I have some images here of cadenzas for several of the Mozart concerti. And so we have those materials. This is always, I think, an interesting aspect for, and I think an understudied one, that we do have a lot of cadenza materials, especially by these great performers that eventually fall out of use, that are worth taking a look at to see how they, I think it gives some type of insight into how they thought about the music that they were playing. And so I think that's always kind of a fascinating thing. And also you get to see just not only the technical thoughts that they might have had, but also the way that they would organize things musically, and what they deemed, or what it gives you a little bit of a lens into what they deemed was appropriate at the time, which may be different from what we think now, or 100 years ago, or 200. One of the last bits I'm going to talk about here, and then I'll just briefly show you around and then let you take a closer look, is that we have a good deal of correspondence that's interesting to take a look at. I didn't bring out a ton of that, mostly because it takes time to read it, and mostly so you have a chance to take a look at this. But among the things that I brought out are some materials from Chrysler to other people. And then also, like, for instance, there's a note from Henrik Schering to, it's actually after Chrysler's death, to his secretary. It's actually the secretary writing, Schering's secretary, and he has a handwritten scrawl on it, but just talking about how he appreciates having access to these materials, and you'll see that note. Just lots of these types of very personal touches that come into play. Along with photo materials. So we have a few out. We have quite a lot of photo materials that you can take a look through in the collection if you were to come in yourself. I thought this was just kind of a funny one-liner from Chrysler to Churchill. If you can't read it, it says, "Congratulations, I hope to reach that goal within a few months myself. Fritz Kreisler." So that's all there is to it, I guess. Nothing more need be said, I guess. And this is on the occasion of Churchill's 85th. So before I show you around a little bit, are there any general questions? Again, mostly this is meant to be informal and give you a sense of what you might be able to find, but do you have any questions about coming to the library and using the collection or exploring further?
When did he decide to start giving his collection to us?
It was 1950. Yeah, I think that was right. 1955, sorry. Yeah, but the violin came before that, I think, a few years before. And I believe there might have been tax reasons involved, but I'm not totally sure about those. But back in those days, that mattered in a different way. And actually, we have some of the materials that say, have valuations of his different instruments. And it's interesting to take a look at those because I think that the Guarneri came in, the last assessment when it came in was $60,000. Other ones they show depreciation, like on a Stradivarius. There's kind of an unusual thing to see. There's one assessment that has one, I can't remember which Stradivari instrument it was, but it was assessed at $25,000, and then it went down to $22,500 because there might have been like an extra crack or something like that, and they were saying that over time it's just not as valuable. Of course, that has changed quite a bit since then. So, if you can.
Are any of these materials yet, are there plans to digitize a lot of this material? Or?
Well, these, no, there aren't. But the part of it is because some of them copyright still attaches. For the ones that we have on display here, we were able to get permission to show them and have the slides up online. So but it's mostly just for, because we're not trying to publish them or anything like that. I think it's actually through Carl Fischer still is now the current owner of the copyright.
Thinking like the photos you mentioned.
Again, it just depends on the timing because he did live until 1962. Copyright still attaches to many things. We always appreciate it when estates are able to give us all those types of rights, but sometimes that's not possible. It just depends on each item even.
I didn't know about that deception business, and so I'm a little confused about the brouhaha. It's not like he was plagiarizing. If I understand, he was just trying to pass off in the style of, without putting his name on it, as the correct composer, not the other way around. I mean, wouldn't the plagiarism be a much worse thing if he were to do that?
Yes and no. If I had to take the anti-Chrysler, I'm pro-Chrysler on this one, but at the same time, because I think it's just kind of funny that he did it
Yeah.
and got away with it. If I had to say one thing that would be negative, say Jay wrote a piece, and I write a piece, but I say it's by Jay, and it's a bad piece. I've now impugned the integrity of his musical work. So there's an element of that comes in, and but there's also, I think, at heart of this, most critics took it with humor, but with Newman and some of the other ones, and he even, I think there's an element of like you're trying to get you with by pulling one over on the critic, because critics, I shouldn't say that. Sometimes there is a tendency for some critics to be a little bit insecure about their knowledge of the repertoire and things like that. So it might be that there's a sense of inadequacy in identifying that this was a fraudulent type of thing. So I think that that's part of it. And Chrysler brought that up. And Newman actually responded saying, basically, I paraphrase, but do you think that I actually listen to your pieces? I've heard maybe 2 or 3 of them in my lifetime, but I'm just saying in principle, this is what's wrong. So.
So the library's had the Chrysler violin for quite a while. Are there any comments for the people who play it about the violin?
Yeah.
What do they say?
In general, I've been here for about 5.5 years, so I just have access to those comments. But everybody who plays it, it's one of their favorite instruments to play on. In fact, many of them prefer it to our Stradivari instruments. It's just very different, though, and it has a different feel to it. Anna-Sophie Mutter played on it, and she was in love with it. It was so we've had people just come and try it out, and also again, like I mentioned, it was in performance just a few weeks ago, and it's just a fabulous instrument, and I think it's easier to sound good on it for some reason. For real violinists coming in to play it, it's easier for them to sound good more quickly than it is on like the Betz or another one of the Strad instruments. I don't know why that is, but it just seems like that's what the experiences are with people.
Is that the letter where Wurlitzer said it's the best violin in the world? At one point, Wurlitzer said is the greatest.
I think that you might be right on that. I'm not totally sure though, but yeah. Oh, he asked if Wurlitzer said that was the best violin in the world, and I can't recall exactly, but it may well be right. Yeah, it may well be though in this letter, and let's pull out these documentation for you to take a look at. So we'll stop there. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to briefly give you I'm going to walk around the table and give you a brief sense of what's where so that you can come up and take a look. And what I ask is that if you don't touch things, that would be great, just so nothing happens to them. But when you come to take a look at them yourself, to do more research or something, you're welcome to take a closer look then. So thanks. We've now gotten so high tech that seamlessly I'm able to walk over here without. Over here we have a piece that Chrysler was very interested in, and I didn't speak about, but the Schumann Fantasy, a piece he actually wrote about and championed. So we have his own kind of a redone orchestration and piano violin version of that. Here's just one page of his response to Ernest Newman. Here we have that sharing letter, and I might just turn it over. And actually, this is probably the best page because you can see that he's just appreciative of seeing the Chrysler materials. Here we have a material related to the Yeah, this is right. The $60,000 valuation of the quaternary. This is the Schubert impromptu transcription I mentioned. The 2 Bach concerti. This one has this is the Wilhelmia version with the penciled in annotations. This one's manuscript. Here's the Beethoven Cavatina transcription. Caprice Viennoise, the orchestral version. The Vivaldi concerto. A picture of this violin with his torque bow, I think, and a manuscript that I particularly like because it has a big marking in the middle that says gong. So he made sure that you'll know. I think it's funny, but we have his Rachmaninoff transcription of the G minor prelude. We have an Irving Berlin transcription of Blue Skies. We have some interesting pictures I'll let you make your own conclusions about. We have over here kind of a strange situation in which we often get business papers. We appreciate getting business papers with collections because they tell us a bit more about a lot of things. And of course, Chrysler was very involved in the recording industry. And this is what I believe, and I need to do more research into it, but I believe is a poor investment that he made of $10,000 into a technology that Victor advised him against doing. But of course, he went to Victor after he had already invested. So Victor is basically saying, it would cost us $500,000 plus royalties just to be able to incorporate this, and it doesn't do anything that's any good anyway. So they say, we all deeply appreciate your thought and consideration of us in the matter, and are only sorry that we did not have an opportunity to consult and advise with you before you made this investment. So those types of things are very interesting to take a look at. This is the classical manuscripts, but this is so you can see the this version is with Chrysler being written as Louis Couperin Chrysler. So you can see that it's saying that it's Couperin's work. This is just an example of some songs that were, this one was actually removed from a set of 3 German songs. This one happens to have 4. So this is the removed one just because it's so obscure I thought you might as well see it. I think we have Liebesfreude and a coda that he wrote in 1960 to Liebesfreude. A piano, and he also had some serious works for piano and violin. This is one called Episode, and I think that's one that Schering mentions in that note. Here's that Berger dedication of a fantasy for violin and piano. This is from when he was 7 or 8. Liebeslied, the orchestral version. This is that O Sanctissima. And that's that. So I'll let you go ahead and go on in and take a closer look.